Hello, and welcome back to the Intuition Activation Podcast. I'm Jessica, a spiritual medium and intuitive coach, and I'm so thrilled that you're here to join me for this intuitive development journey. So, welcome back to another episode of the show. However, this week I will not be sharing some intuitive development tips, and I'm going to be sharing something a little bit different. As I mentioned last week, a lot of you on Instagram have messaged me curious about my free birth story. So, as you know, I did give birth to a beautiful baby boy. We named him Benny just a little over 2 weeks ago. And I decided to do it in a pretty radical way. I did a free birth, which in simple terms means that I gave birth at home completely unassisted. So, with no midwife, no doula, just me and my husband and our 2-year-old son present. We did it all on our own. And we also had a wild, excuse me, a wild pregnancy, which means that we had no medical testing or intervention, checkups, or otherwise throughout the pregnancy. I simply was just pregnant and then gave birth as naturally as possible. And so many of you are curious as to not only how the birth went, but what kind of brought me to make this decision and brought me to a place where I felt confident enough to do this by myself and sort of what the experience was like for me. And I will say that it was definitely a very empowering experience. I don't think I will ever give birth any other way. I just loved it so much doing it this way in my own space, my own home, on my own terms, with nobody else interfering or intervening. And I'm really excited to share sort of how I came to that decision and then how the birth actually went. And I do want to share that there's no judgment for anybody who chooses to birth in any other way. I always feel that when you're giving birth, you always have to do what makes you feel most comfortable. And this is surprisingly what felt most comfortable and peaceful for me. And I know some of the things that I'm going to mention in today's podcast are probably going to be extremely fear inducing for some of you. And the funny thing is that for me, the opposite is true, that some of the things that are considered more conventional or that are considered, more typical in the pregnancy and birth process were fear inducing for me. And so avoiding a lot of those things actually led to a much more blissful and peaceful birth for me. However, I completely respect that that's not usually the case for most people. And I'm always an advocate for what feels best for you and what's going to make you feel safest and most comfortable. So, this podcast episode is purely based on my own decisions, my own personal views and values, but it is in no way a judgment on anybody else's choices that they choose to make because birth is very personal. And I'm just excited to be sharing my journey in the hopes that maybe it will be maybe something, maybe somewhat eye-opening for some of you, maybe inspirational if you were considering ever doing a home birth or even a free birth, that you can hear the experience of somebody else and feel like, hey, maybe I can do this too. And if not, it might just be an interesting story. So, before we dive into this week's episode, I do want to remind you that today that this episode is coming out is the last day to use the coupon code Indra, all caps, for 15% off your session with Indra. So, Indra being my colleague who I personally trained, an extremely talented intuitive. She's really, really talented at not only channeling your spirit guides, but also channeling your loved ones, which is a skill that I would argue I am not as talented at. She's also a very powerful energy healer, and she incorporates that into her sessions. So if you are wanting to book a session with Indra, go ahead and grab your spot and get that 15% off discount using the code Indra, capital INDRA, and get your spot before the coupon code expires tonight at midnight. You don't want to miss this. There's not going to be a discount this big for a while. So definitely grab it while it's still there. Also, be sure to tune into the podcast platform tomorrow, because tomorrow, being June 1st, I will be releasing the June energy forecast. So there will be 2 episodes coming out this week, today's episode and then the energy forecast. that I am going to channel hopefully later today to come out for June 1st. So I'm excited to see what comes through for the month of June. And if you are watching this on YouTube, be sure to head over to the podcast platform, so either Apple or Spotify, to hear the energy forecast and see what lies ahead for the month of June. I think it's going to be an interesting one. All right, well, that's all I have to share for announcements. So let's dive in to today's episode. So, as I said before, I do really want to underline here that nothing that I'm about to share is here to be me casting judgment on anybody else's decisions. This is really kind of what made me feel most comfortable. And so I am going to share with you sort of what brought me to the decision of even wanting to do a free birth in the first place. I know it's pretty unconventional or pretty radical for most people in the 21st century to do something like this. But I do want to argue that for me, a lot of my personal outlook or perhaps weariness towards conventional allopathic medicine are strongly due to how I was raised. So this is not something that was so new or outlandish for me, considering the childhood that I had. And so my mother is a chiropractor, but she's also a homeopathic doctor and a certified functional medicine practitioner. So I was raised in a home where I was taught to always reach for the natural remedy first. And any drug, even as small as Tylenol or otherwise, was only ever considered as a last resort. In fact, I never had Tylenol in my life until I was about 19 years old, when I had gone through a pretty intense dental surgery and needed it for, I guess, the pain of recovering from that surgery. So up until then, I'd actually never even had something as small as Tylenol. So you can imagine that in my home, it was always they choose the natural remedy first, use food as medicine, prevention medicine such as chiropractic care and eating well and taking supplements were always sort of at the forefront of our home. And allopathic medicine or Western medicine and conventional sort of medical practices were not prominent in our household and often sort of, I don't know if I would say feared, but definitely looked down upon, or even just sort of seen as only a last resort. We only resort to it if nothing else works. But the messaging was always try everything else as naturally as possible before ever resorting to a man-made drug, so to speak. And so this was sort of the messaging that I grew up with. I have always sort of been taught and told to avoid allopathic medicine in a lot of ways. We did have a family doctor, but he also while he was certified to prescribe drugs if necessary, he seldomly did. He actually worked out of his office was in the back of a Waldorf school. And so, he also sort of had the same outlook that he would offer you any other type of remedy, natural homeopathics to naturopathic medicines, herbal remedies, all of those things before he would ever reach for the prescription pad and offer you a drug of some kind. So it was always considered a last resort and only if at most necessary. And so, it doesn't mean that we totally have written it off. Of course, if it's necessary, there are times where, nothing else works and you do maybe need an antibiotic or you do need, medicine to take over, but it's sort of like avoid if possible and only go that route if really nothing else has worked. And so I have always been taught to sort of see it as a last result. And we were always about sort of looking for the root cause of a symptom that someone is having as opposed to treating the symptom itself. Fevers were never feared in my home, right? There was really a lot of messaging around your body is strong, your body knows how to support itself. Let's do what we can to give your body the right environment to promote its own healing so that your body can do the work. And that, it will do what it needs to do, and we're just going to support the body's natural functioning. So this was always the messaging I grew up with. And so for most people already, that's a little bit, radical and unconventional. But that was really kind of the community that I was raised in. And so I already was kind of predisposed to having an aversion to medical intervention of any kind. And so when it came to giving birth and giving birth to my first baby, the thought of giving birth in a hospital was never really an option in my mind. I never saw that as necessary. And even though my own mother had given birth in a hospital, 30 some odd years ago, she used midwives and she did it as naturally as possible. And this was before midwives were regulated by our province. And so the things that were done then were again a lot more natural than are now, because the midwives currently in Ontario are under our free healthcare system, which means that they're highly regulated by the government and there are certain protocols that they have to follow. And I don't think I realized this with my first birth. I just assumed that if I went with a midwife, I would get as most natural as experience as I wanted. I soon learned after giving birth to my first son that that wasn't the case, and I will talk about why that is. But I did choose the midwife option with my first son, with my first birth, thinking that this was the only way that I would be allowed to give birth at home with assistance. And so that is what I did with my first son. And there were some flaws in that I kind of realized post birth. And I remember walking into my very first appointment with a midwife with my first son and her asking me how I felt about the birth. I think she was wondering if I had fears around it. I actually told her no. In fact, I'm actually quite excited. I'm excited for the feeling of empowerment that I hope to feel after accomplishing something so intense as giving birth. Not just naturally, but just, being the portal that brings a life into this world. And I had told her, I had wanted to do it as naturally as possible. And, I really was looking forward to that feeling of empowerment of kind of going, I did that. And I remember after my first son's birth, feeling quite disappointed that even though I did give birth naturally and at home, I didn't feel empowered and I felt disappointed. And I couldn't put my finger on why I felt that way. Because in many cases, giving birth at home is already considered, unmedicated is already considered quite a feat in our culture. But for me, there was never any other option. And so the feeling of empowerment, I couldn't figure out why I felt like the process of giving birth at home with midwives didn't feel the way I had hoped it would feel. And now looking back, having done a free birth and learning a little bit more about sort of the process and the interventions that midwives are required to perform, I realize now sort of some of the ways that they still intervened with my birth and they still sabotaged some of my relationship with my newborn at the time. So I do want to share a little bit of that because that is what sort of brought me to decide that I didn't want midwives involved at all in this second pregnancy of mine. And so, some of the things that I noticed with the midwife, and again, I remember feeling very shocked because in my mind, I thought if you birth with a midwife, then you get to do it as naturally as possible, have a spontaneous physiological birth, a birth that has no intervention, that a midwife is simply there to bear witness. And that's just simply not the case here in Ontario. Again, they're highly regulated and there are certain things that they have to check off their list. They have to say that they did as a standard of care for you. And I found in the appointments that I had with my first son, there's regular appointments. You have to go and see the midwife. And the regular appointments I found to be quite unnecessary. All they would do was measure my belly, weigh me, and check the baby's heart rate. And even then I would fight them because I would not let them use the Doppler, that little device that it's like a little mini ultrasound device that they put on your belly to hear the baby's heartbeat. And I insisted on them using a fetoscope, which looks a little bit more like a stethoscope, in order to hear the baby's heartbeat, which of course is much harder for them. But I was aware of sort of the radiation that gives off and did not allow them to do that. So even just in the regular checkup appointments, I was already kind of, I don't know if I would say fighting with them, but feeling that some of the things they were doing were unnecessary. And, so in some cases, the regular checkup appointments felt really kind of silly to me. And I'm kind of thinking the midwives were already, a 35-40 minute drive away from where we were living at the time. And it felt like such a nuisance, and I hated having to go. So that in and of itself was a bit of a burdensome experience. And then, on the appointments that were a little less just routine checkups, I found myself fighting them at every turn of all of the particular protocols that they felt they needed to check off on their list. Things such as regular or routine ultrasounds. I, similar to X-ray, I really have an aversion to the use of ultrasounds, because I do know sort of the impact that they can actually have on fetal development. Now, I don't claim to be a an expert or a doctor. However, through the free birthing course that I have taken and some studies that I have read, there is something to be said about the ultrasounds actually altering genetic makeup. And again, I don't have the right wording for it. That's something I would encourage you to look up if you're interested. But there is evidence to be seen that ultrasounds do harm the baby, and that they do they also are it is quite loud for the baby, and uncomfortable for the baby. And I remember seeing whenever they did force me into doing ultrasounds with my first son, he would cover his ears and turn his head away, and I could see that the sound was incredibly uncomfortable for him. And I remember feeling like and telling the ultrasound technician to hurry up and to stop, and really not wanting to be doing these ultrasounds but being forced into them. My midwives telling me that they will not and would not work with me unless I did at least two of those ultrasounds, one being a dating ultrasound so they could tell me when my due date was and how big the baby was, and then another one being the anatomy scan at 20 weeks so they could make sure that the baby was developing normally, which I've now learned is not exactly accurate. And the dating one is just a means of fear mongering because it's not really that accurate in terms of predicting your due date, or how far along you are. And at the end of the day, is it necessary if you're going to give birth at 40 weeks or 43 weeks? It doesn't really matter. Your baby's going to come out when your baby's going to come out. And so I always kind of wondered, and being given a deadline, they put a lot of pressure on you that if you don't give birth by a certain time, they're going to induce you. They're going to put you in the hospital. And that was incredibly stressful in the experience as well, of them giving me a date. And if the baby doesn't come by the arbitrary date that they determined, that they were going to they would threaten me with induction. And I really found that quite stressful as well. Things such as the glucose test, where they make you drink that orange stuff, which I absolutely refuse to do, to make sure that you don't have gestational diabetes, I found really unnecessary. So, there were a lot of things that the midwives kept insisting on me doing, that I found myself fighting them all along the journey. And there were some things that I was able to sort of hold my ground, and they were willing to let go, such as the glucose test and using the Doppler. But there were some things that they really were adamant about, such as the ultrasounds, that they would not let me continue care with them if I did not get those ultrasounds. And that to me was extremely troubling. Because again, in my mind, I kind of think, well, what happened, over 100 years ago when ultrasound didn't exist, right? Women gave birth. This is how women have been giving birth for since the beginning of time without the use of allopathic medicine and these interventions. And, there have been many babies. And yes, of course, I know the opposite argument being that, but there are also many risks. What I've come to learn is that a lot of those risks are not as intense or as dire or fatal as a lot of us have been taught to believe. And so, I just really didn't want to have a repeat experience of fighting somebody all along the way in this second pregnancy, of all of the tests that they felt were necessary, that they have their boxes that needed to be checked off, and the fear mongering that was involved in that. Um, and so I really was starting to kind of feel the resistance towards entering into that experience again with my second child. Um, there was even the experience of, a couple of the other things that they sort of did to fear monger me and to manipulate me was, they would always tell me, the baby has to be head down. And this is one of the reasons we do the ultrasounds and check on you is if the baby's not head down, we will not let you give birth at home. This really put a lot of pressure on me in that time because I knew for me, giving birth in a hospital, that was the fear inducing thing. I definitely didn't want to give birth in a hospital because I knew all of the interventions that would be forced on me and that I would be in such a vulnerable state that it would be hard for me to stand my ground while I'm in labor. And so the thought of being threatened with C-sections, the thought of being threatened with, transfers to the hospital, and inductions and all of these things really weighed heavily on me during my first birth. And they put a lot of pressure on me to make sure that that baby was head down. And I really felt like I had to do everything in my power to make sure that he was, in order to avoid the threat of having to give birth in a hospital setting. And so luckily I have a lot of chiropractors in my life. Both my husband and my mother are chiropractors. And my husband was an associate with another chiropractor that he worked with who actually was quite proficient in turning babies. And so yes, my first son also was not head down initially, but through chiropractic care, we were able to sort of get the baby to move, move head down and really make sure that he stayed that way. Given that he doesn't flip last minute kind of a thing. And so that was really incredibly stressful, and me making sure that I got enough appointments and did all of the things and got into all of the right positions and hung upside down to make sure and really make sure that this baby was head down so that the midwives would allow me to give birth at home and not make me transfer to the hospital, at any point in my labor. So that was incredibly stressful. And then I remember being even more shocked when at around 38 weeks, the midwife started urging me to do membrane sweeps to get labor started. And I remember being extremely shocked at this because I kind of thought, I'm not even 40 weeks, right? This baby is not even, I mean, I guess at 38 weeks, you're considered full term, but there's based on the deadline they gave me, there's still 2 more weeks to go. Why do we have to start labor now? Why do we have to do anything to manipulate my body's natural functions? And that was just routine for them, that this is something they do where they sweep your membranes to, even if it doesn't put you into labor, it will start to get things started. And I just didn't understand why that was necessary. And I realized later on that, these midwives had a lot of women on their case that had the same due date, and they were trying to spread us out. They were trying to stagger us to make things easier for themselves, which to me felt incredibly, I don't know, just misleading and uncomfortable. Um, Manipulative, I guess is the word. And so I of course refused membrane sweeps. I didn't feel that it was necessary to intervene with my body's natural function in any way. And every appointment from the time of 38 weeks up until my due date, I was fighting them on saying, I do not want a membrane sweep. I don't want the Foley bulb. I think that's what it's called. I don't want you sticking anything up there that's going to induce labor for me. And then when it finally hit my due date with my first son, I had an appointment on that day. And my midwife had said, if I don't give birth by the end of the week, so by the end of the 40th week, they were going to induce me and I was going to have to give birth in the hospital. And I am going to have to get an ultrasound in a few days, to make sure that my waters weren't leaking and that everything was okay. We don't typically let you stay pregnant longer than 41 weeks, something like that. And that was so stressful already. So now they were threatening me with another ultrasound and an induction, which again, I really didn't want. And I didn't want to be giving birth in the hospital. So this, again, there was a lot of fear around this and me sort of feeling very pressured to make sure that this baby came out. So now I'm sort of scattering and searching for means of naturally inducing labor, to encourage my own body to get started on labor so that I wouldn't have to, do yet another ultrasound and or be induced. And this was so stressful. And so at this time, fortunately, there was a Chinese medicine practitioner, acupuncturist who worked in my mother's office, and my husband also is pretty well versed in acupuncture. And so we started using acupuncture. There's certain acupressure points or acupuncture points which are known to induce labor. And surprisingly, they're actually kind of near your legs. They're not kind of anywhere near your uterus, but apparently they can stimulate labor. And so we started doing those every day to try to get labor started. And it was because I felt under a lot of pressure. And so I think I did 3 or 4 rounds of acupuncture to try and get labor started, to avoid having to get that ultrasound, to avoid having to be induced, because the midwives were threatening me to have to give birth in the hospital. So the last one that we did was the night that I ended up giving birth to my son, my older son. And the funny thing is, it was the date that I had predicted he was going to come, which was actually only 2 or 3 days after my given due date. And my husband had given me acupuncture that evening at around 10 p.m. And about 2 to 3 hours later, labor started. Um, and so in that birth, um, the labor was swift. It was fast and quick. And there were, again, a couple of things that I felt like, had the midwives not been involved, it would have been so much smoother and easier for me. I gave birth on when I went into labor, because this was my first labor. My contractions were never long distances apart. I went right into 4 minutes apart. First one, and then the next one came 4 minutes later. So we called the midwives because they said that when they're that close together, you need to call them. And they said, "How long have you been in labor?" I said, "Less than an hour." They said, "This is your first birth." And they told me, "Take a Tylenol and go back to bed." And I went, first of all, no, I'm not taking a Tylenol. And secondly, I cannot go back to sleep. These are so close together. They said, "You've got hours, you've got lots of time." It was a full moon that night. And what I found out later, the midwives had told me, is that they were at the hospital, and 7 other women had gone into labor that night who were on their caseload. And they were busy at the hospital taking care of those other women before they were ready to come and see me, who was 25 minutes north of the hospital. And so they were really trying to kind of prolong me and convince me that I wasn't, in fact, in as active labor as they felt I could or should be, given it was my first birth. So a couple of hours had gone by, maybe 2 hours, where I then felt that I was in transition. I felt the urge to push. I felt my body pushing. We called the midwives again, and we said, "You better get over here because I feel the need to push." My waters have kind of gently started to leak, but they didn't fully burst. But I can definitely feel the urge to push. They're intense. And the midwife said to my husband over the phone, "Put it on speakerphone. I need to hear her screaming. I don't think she's in that kind of labor yet. I don't think she's in active labor yet." So while I had been in the zone and actually had been keeping it pretty cool and calm, my husband encouraged me to scream so that the midwives would get over there. Isn't that insane? It's insane to me that I had to yell in order to get the midwives to actually come to our home. So that to me was already kind of like, what the heck? So I put on a performance and I yelled and I groaned and I moaned until the midwives finally went, "Okay, I guess you are in active labor." She said, "Well, we can't get to you right now. We're with 7 other ladies at the moment. We're going to send a backup, a midwife you haven't met who works in our office. She'll be there. Do not push until she gets there. Um, Otherwise, call an ambulance." Now, for those of you who have been in labor before, um, if anyone ever tells you not to push when your body's pushing or when you feel the urge to push, it is incredibly difficult to do that. The amount of breathing that I had to do to hold on and wait, because they didn't feel I was allowed to push my baby out when I felt the need to, because they needed to make sure that I was, in fact, 10 centimeters dilated. So I had to go through, about 20 minutes of contractions in active labor, just breathing through it and hoping not to push because there was no midwife present. So that already was incredibly uncomfortable. This midwife, who I'd never met before, shows up. Luckily, she was very kind. As soon as she gets there, she checks me and she says, "Oh, yeah, you're 10 centimeters. You can go ahead and push." And I'm thinking, yeah, I could have told you that 20 minutes ago. Um, she kind of, moved me over to the bedroom, and they had she had me lay down on my back in the bed. And I remember going, I know that this is not how I want to be giving birth. I feel that that's actually counterproductive to giving birth. I want to use gravity. I want to stand up. I want to be moving. Why are you lying me down on my back and telling me to push that way? So I said no, and I got up, and finally my other midwives arrived. And then they started telling me when I should be pushing. And then my midwives also stuck her finger up my area and broke my water for me, which now I realize is so unnecessary. I had a friend there who was my doula at the time. She had showed up way before the midwives did. And she had told me later that she didn't understand why they did that. And the only thing she could think of was that they were trying to speed things up. They had just been up all night doing 7 other labors, and they just wanted this one over with. And I really think that that's possibly what was going on. Why did she need to break my water? It would have broken on its own. Um, and then the midwife kept doing perennial massages on me to try and speed things up. And then telling me when to push and not sort of allowing me to kind of feel my own body out and let me feel when it was time to push the baby out. And I remember feeling incredibly kind of checked out when the midwives were there. I felt like they, first of all, there was three of them plus a student, plus my doula, plus my husband, plus both of my parents in the room. There's so many people in the room, and I just wanted to be alone and in my head, and I couldn't be because there was all these flies on the wall sort of having a say in what needed to be done. And I really didn't enjoy that experience of there being so many people in the room. I didn't enjoy being told when I should be pushing. And in the end, because I was forced to push at times that didn't feel aligned, I ended up tearing quite terribly. I had a pretty deep tear, not in my perineum, but on the side. And and according to the midwives, requiring quite a bit of stitching. And I don't know that that would have been the case had I not been forcing it, right? And me just kind of wanting the experience to be over and wanting everybody out of my house. And so, I gave birth, the baby came out head first, tumbling down, the midwife caught him. And then they sat me on the bed, they let me hold him for a minute, and I remember just wanting to nurse him. And they told me I had to wait. I had to wait to nurse him because it was more important that they stitched me up. That was more important than me bonding with my baby. And I had taken some birth courses and being told in this about this idea of the golden hour, that first hour is really the time when you should be bonding with your baby, that you should be holding your baby, that you should be nursing with your baby, that you should be having this skin to skin contact. And meanwhile, the midwives were sabotaging that, and they were telling me that that wasn't important, that I should let the baby cry, and that they needed to stitch me up, and that I could not nurse him. And I kept wanting to, and they kept telling me not to. And I remember feeling really upset about that. And then only a few minutes after the baby had been born, they insisted on cutting the cord right away. And I had told them I wanted delayed cord clamping. And they said, well, a delay is anything longer than 2 minutes. It's been 10. Let's cut it. And I remember also being upset about that. And they said, don't worry, all of the blood has drained from the cord. It's fine. It's white now. We can cut it. And I remember thinking that didn't feel right to me. I wanted to just leave it. And they just wanted to get out of there. They had been up all night. They had had 7 other births in the hospital that night. They were just trying to speed everything up. And I really didn't appreciate the rushed feeling that they kind of imposed on me during my first birth. And so, while it was beautiful in the sense that I got to have a home birth and that I got to get into my own bed right after, and my husband got to be there and all of the things, I didn't feel empowered after that birth. I felt that someone else had taken control and had taken the reins of my birth. And so when it came time, and then I really do feel that them delaying my son and I getting to nurse right away really sabotaged our nursing relationship. My son had an extremely difficult time learning to latch. Postpartum, it took 12 weeks before he could figure out how to latch, and that became incredibly stressful. Them convincing me that my son had a tongue tie when in fact he really didn't. And the way that they had forced me to push did sort of alter the structure of his skull, him then needing cranial sacral therapy to help with his latching. Again, all things that could have been avoided had I not been forced to push, had I been allowed to nurse when I wanted to. And so all of these things felt like sabotage to me and really, really hurt my nursing relationship and the initial relationship I had with my son and the calm, relaxing environment that I had wanted for my birth. So it didn't feel empowering. In fact, it felt stressful. And the birth was not what I had envisioned. As much as it was natural, quote unquote, it wasn't in a lot of ways, and it felt manipulated and forced. And so when it came time to give birth to my second son, when we found out I was pregnant, I did contact the midwives. Now at this point, we had moved to a new city, so these were different midwives. And the first and I did have the first initial appointment with a midwife, and the first intake was actually just over the phone. I didn't even have to go into the office. And she did her initial intake and started asking me all of these questions about my health and about testing and all of these things. And this midwife started convincing me that I was going to need a whole bunch of testing that I really didn't feel was necessary, genetic testing and otherwise, ultrasounds and all of these things, dating ultrasounds, and starting to wanting to get me scheduled for all of these things. And I remember, and again, her feeling very adamant, very strongly, and trying to encourage me that I needed all of these things. And I remember getting off of the phone and getting off of that call and feeling very nauseous. And I know I was pregnant, right? So it's not that it wasn't morning sickness. I can guarantee you it was not morning sickness that was occurring. I felt a lump in my throat. I felt nauseous. I felt a pit in my stomach. And I got off that call and I turned to my husband and I said, I cannot work with this midwife. I cannot. I can't do this again. I hate having to fight them all through my journey. I don't want to have to be driving. This midwife office was 35 minutes away. Again, I don't want to be driving these 35 minutes now with my toddler who hates the car for all of these appointments. And that just feels so unnecessary. I just don't want to be experiencing this. Once again, my husband said, and my husband, who I'm so grateful, is so incredibly supportive, said, okay, we'll find another way. And he was so supportive that he kind of said, this is your journey, this is your experience, this is your birth. We will do it how you feel most comfortable. And at this time, having moved to this new city, I had joined a mother's group who was very crunchy and conscious. And one of the women in the group is a doula who was trained, who had taken this course, who was trained by a company called the Free Birth Society. And she was certified as what they coined a radical birth keeper. And so she was very well versed in this idea or this concept of free birth, which I, in fact, had not heard of at the time. And she kind of had encouraged me to look out for their podcast called it's called the Free Birth Society, to go and listen to this podcast, which was examples of all of these women who had given birth naturally at home, unassisted, unmedicated, who had had wild pregnancies with zero intervention, and to see if this was something that felt aligned for me. And if I didn't feel comfortable doing it completely alone, that she offered her services to me, that she was trained by them, and that she would allow me to have the completely spontaneous, unassisted birth that I was hoping for, but she could hold my hand in the process if I felt that that was necessary. And so I dove right into listening to that podcast. And in doing so, sort of heard similar stories of sabotage, if in most cases were much worse than mine, of women experiencing in their first birth and therefore choosing to have a free birth for their second or third births. And the experience, being incredibly natural. And so I decided to go down this route. And and explore it a little further, and they offered a course. It was called The Ultimate Guide to Free Birth, and it just so happened that at the time that was making this decision, they were having a big sale where the course was 50% off. So I bought the course, and I decided to go through the videos and learn, like, could I actually do this by myself? So at first I was a little bit scared, right? There are a lot of what ifs that come around that we're taught to be worried about when it comes to giving birth, such as what if your baby is breech? What if you have, your placenta doesn't release? Or what if, there's so many what ifs that you're taught to fear. What if you bleed out and hemorrhage, or, all of these different sort of things that are considered possibilities when you give birth and that we're taught to believe are extremely dangerous when we give birth. But the more that I moved through the videos of this course, and my husband and I watched them together, the more we learned that a lot of these scenarios that we're taught to fear are, in most cases, extremely rare. And if they do occur, are not as dire as we're taught to believe. In fact, they're not situations where if you do require medical care, that you need to get to a hospital immediately. Otherwise, you face death. And it's really not the truth. It's that in most cases, you have a lot of time to get medical assistance if you need to before the situation becomes, in fact, dire. And so this gave me a lot of confidence to recognize that, yes, of course, if there was something really wrong or untoward, I could go to the hospital, right? And that I would have plenty of time to do so. But in most cases, that wouldn't be necessary. And that there were things that I could do myself as interventions that if these things did come up, that I actually wouldn't need to go to the hospital in most cases, that these things are, again, not medically, necessary for medical intervention in the first place. And so the more that I took this course and the more I learned about how natural and spontaneous birth is meant to be, um, the more I felt confident in the fact that I could, in fact, do this myself, that birth really isn't as scary as we're taught to believe. And as we sort of continued to watch this course or take this course and go down, I initially had enlisted the help of this friend of mine, this doula of mine, to be present at the birth, just in case, right? In case I didn't know what to do, in case I freaked out, in case my husband freaked out. But by the time I finished taking the course, I really tuned in with myself and tried to envision what my ideal birth would be. And I actually even connected to the spirit of this baby, who at the time I still thought was a girl. Um, and every time I pictured my birth, I pictured myself completely alone in my bathroom with low, dim lighting, doing this on my own, connecting to my body, connecting to the spirit of my baby, and doing this myself. And I couldn't picture it any other way. I pictured that my husband was home and present and available, but not actually even in the room. I felt very strongly that I needed to do this by myself. And when I connected to the spirit of my baby, I kept hearing this baby say, "It's me and you, mama. We're going to do this together. You've got this." And I just kept hearing that voice and this feeling and this urge that that's how I needed to do it. And so it was actually quite coincidental that my friend who was a doula then called me and said that she was so sorry, but around the week that I was probably likely going to give birth, she had an opportunity to go to Florida, and would I be okay if she went? And I felt so convicted in the fact that this was a sign that I was going to do this by myself, that I could in fact do this by myself. And that the universe was giving me that nudge of like, you don't need this plan B. You don't need a backup. You can do this on your own. So I told her, have a great trip, right? It's fine. I will call you on the phone if I need anything. And it just so happened that a couple of neighbors, a neighbor of ours who lived one street over that we see at the park quite frequently with our son, our kids play together sometimes. They were keeping it kind of hush hush, but they had given birth on New Year's Eve, so a couple months earlier, to a beautiful baby boy. And we started to talk, and I soon discovered that they too took the course from Free Birth Society. They had had midwives all throughout her pregnancy and fired the midwife kind of the last minute because the midwife was threatening them with a need to be induced with the need for a C-section, and she knew she didn't need that. So she then took the Free Birth Society course, and her husband gave birth, free birth at home on their own just a couple of months before I was meant to do the same thing. And so they shared their story with us, and then they shared their birth supplies with us, the cord clamps and, that was, and some gauze, right? We didn't really need that much stuff. And they said, if we could do it, so can you. And that was just even more confirmation that this was how I was supposed to bring this baby into the world. And so I was very convicted in sort of my decision that this is how I was going to do it. that it was just going to be me and my husband and my son at home, and we were going to do this ourselves. And so when it came time to actually give birth, and it's so funny because, I do claim to be, a psychic medium, but I never claim to be 100% accurate, especially when it comes to my own things. I too have mediums that I see when, it comes to channeling things for myself. Sometimes we're so opaque to ourselves, it's a lot easier to channel for somebody else. We can be more objective. And so, when I did connect to the spirit of this baby, the baby did kept continue to tell me that they were coming on May 8th. And even though the midwife that I had spoken with in that initial appointment dated that my due date to be May 1st, I somehow knew that May 8th was the day the baby was coming. And this was the same with my first son. I knew the day he was coming, and that was in fact the day he came. My elder son came on March 17th, even though the due date was was a few days earlier than that. And the same with this one. They had told me my due date was May 1st, and I just knew that that was too early, that this baby was coming on May 8th. And so the night of May 7th, the baby still hadn't come. It was well past May 1st. And I said to my husband, I think the baby's going to come in the morning. I really do. And so that evening we went to we have this really, a vegan restaurant that we really enjoy. We went and got takeout. We took our son to our favorite little beach. It's a park on a beach by the lake, and we had a little picnic as our last evening as a family of three, knowing very well that I would probably go into labor that night. And so we really just savored those last few moments as a family of three, and really spent a lot of time focusing on our 2-year-old and our son, and enjoying kind of this beautiful little picnic by the beach. We went home and we put our son to sleep in our bed because we still co-sleep with him. And my husband and I kind of decided that we wanted to be intimate with each other that night as sort of a one last time before this baby comes and we can no longer do so. Also, keeping in mind that potentially it might stimulate labor. That wasn't the intention of it, but we did just want to feel close to each other one more time before that was not a possibility kind of postpartum. So I don't know if that did in fact stimulate labor or if the baby was just always meant to come on May 8th. I don't know. But we were intimate with each other and then we went to sleep. I did feel a little crampy post that, but I had been feeling crampy sort of all week. So I didn't think anything of it and I slept soundly. I had a pretty good sleep. Up until about 3 in the morning when I woke up May 8th, 3 a.m., and started to feel some contractions or some surges, some labor starting. And they were pretty far apart to the point where I was able to sleep in between them. And I kind of stayed in bed for the first hour or two of contractions. And I just kind of felt them through. It kind of felt like really bad period cramps, right? Early labor. Um, Sorry, I am wearing the baby, so he's getting a little hot here. And so it wasn't until about 5 a.m. that they started to get more intense, and I finally woke my husband up. And I asked him to go and get the yoga ball. We had a big labor kind of yoga ball. I felt the need to move around, and I told him labor had started. So he went and got the yoga ball for me, and I moved over to the yoga ball and continued to sort of, experience the contractions using breath. I was calm. I was quiet. It was very nice. And it was fine. And then when things started to pick up a little bit more, I always wanted to try and see if getting into the tub, if the warm water would actually assist in the pain that I was experiencing, if it would help me feel better in any way. I've heard a lot of stories of women feeling that, warm bath or the warm water and a water birth was so beautiful. So I told my husband I was going to go get into the tub, and that he could go back to sleep. So that's what he did. He went back to sleep and I got into the tub. I don't know what it is, but for me, the water did nothing. In fact, I felt it kind of restricting. I don't know if it's because our bathtub is not exactly very large. I just felt like I couldn't move around enough and that it was uncomfortable because the bottom of the bathtub is hard. And I just wanted to be on my knees and I didn't want, I needed to move around and I didn't feel that I could move around as well in the water. And I didn't find the warm water to be relieving of any more so than just breathing for me. So I quickly got out of the tub, to be honest, and just grabbed the yoga ball and just hung out on the bathroom floor. I had put some towels down to support my knees, and just kind of hung out with my elbows on the yoga ball, and kind of breathed through the contractions as best I could. Around 6:30 a.m., my son woke up, crying for me and wondering where I was. So my husband brought him to the bathroom, our master bathroom, and showed him that, baby is coming. Mama is getting ready to birth the baby. And he swiftly took my son downstairs to give him breakfast. And we had bought a few new toys for him to play with to keep him occupied while I was in labor. And our plan was that my husband had the baby monitor. So we had one in the bathroom where I was, and my husband had the other one. And we were communicating like walkie-talkies via the baby monitor while he was downstairs keeping our son entertained. And I was sort of just working through the contractions, the labor pains. And so that's what I was doing. I was breathing through, and I'm not going to say I really wish that I was one of those women who could be really calm through a labor. I had read a couple of books this pregnancy about pain-free birth, ecstatic birth, orgasmic birth, blissful birth, a lot of them talking about surrendering, a lot of them talking about breathing, exercises. Um, I tried my best to implement all of them, all of the different techniques that I had been taught, means of surrender to avoid sort of the pain of labor. And I wish I could say that I was strong and that I didn't make noise, but that really wasn't the case. For me, I will argue that this birth was incredibly painful. I was not cool or calm in any way. I was groaning, I was wailing, I was definitely crying. It was hurting, for sure. And I didn't quite realize, maybe now I think about it, it may have been because of the position the baby was in. I don't know. But yeah, I just don't give birth quietly. And so luckily my husband just turned down the volume on the baby monitor, so my son didn't hear me screaming too loud. But of course we had prepared him well ahead of time that mommy was going to make noise when he gave birth, and that he would be downstairs with Papa. And that is what happened. And he seemed completely unfazed by what was going on. And in this birth, again, I was just on the yoga ball, my elbows on the ball, my knees on the floor, just kind of rocking back and forth, sweating quite a bit. And every once in a while, my husband would come upstairs to try and check on me, make sure, see if I needed anything. He brought me some electrolytes and some water to drink, a cool towel to put on my forehead. I was sweating quite a bit. And he kept trying to come in. Our bathroom is kind of small. So, it was a little bit hard for him to come in because I had the yoga ball in front of the door, and he could never get the door open more than a crack. But every time he did, I kept yelling at him to close the door because it would cause a draft and it would make me start to shiver and feel cold. So I kept asking him not to come in because I didn't want to start shivering. I didn't want to feel cold. And so he would sometimes sit outside the door, but mostly he was just hanging out downstairs with my son and just checking in on me through the walkie-talkie. How's it going? Are you okay? As things got a little more intense closer to the end, I even asked him to stop checking. I asked him to stop talking. I said, I will call you when the baby's head is coming out, right? I'll let you know when to come upstairs. He said, okay. And he just kept listening for me on the walkie-talkie or on the baby monitor. And I remember thinking this whole time throughout this birth, I kind of was wondering, like, why hasn't my water broken yet? I've been going through these contractions, and I kind of just remember thinking, if my water would just break, I feel like I would feel such relief. And the water just wasn't breaking. And the contractions were stronger and stronger. And there was one thing that I really learned in this birthing course, which is that you're actually not meant to push. Your body will do that itself if you allow it to do so. There's a reflex that comes over you that causes the pushing motion. And when your body is ready to push the baby out, it will. And you actually don't have to do anything. And if you do allow this to happen, you're a lot less likely to experience tearing of any kind. And so I really listened to that advice, and I waited for that experience. I waited for my body to do the pushing. And I can tell you that reflex does come, and it is incredibly strong. It's incredibly powerful. It feels like, I wish I could give a good description. I guess it's sort of like the way you would feel if you have to make a big poo, I guess, and your body's like pushing it out, but like 10,000 times stronger than that. You feel your whole body kind of contract and convulse and bear down. without effort, it does it on its own to the point where it induces noise out of you, right? Like it's really a strong sensation. And so I felt my body doing that. And the first time it did that, um, it did it once and then it did it one more time. And that was when my water broke finally. It was a huge gush of water. What I didn't notice at the time, or what I didn't register at the time, is that in the water, there was actually quite a bit of meconium. So that black tarry poop that kind of comes out of the baby. And I had learned in the free birth course that if you see a lot of meconium in the water, it's a good chance that maybe your baby is not head down, that the contractions are squeezing the poop out of your baby because your baby is maybe bum first or feet first. But I didn't register that in the moment. I just remember thinking like, oh, is that a clot of blood? Like, what is that? And I didn't really register what it was. I just saw a lot of water and a couple of black tarry things in the water and just kept allowing my body to do what it needed to do. Um, After the water broke, that's when, it felt like the baby was right at the surface. So the water broke, and within the next contraction or the next push, the next convulsion, I felt the baby at the surface. So I called to my husband. I said, I think the baby's coming. Come upstairs. So he came and he was out the other side of the door, but he couldn't come in. And I didn't realize that he couldn't get in because of where I was sitting, where the yoga ball was. He actually couldn't open the door. And so I reached down. My husband's standing on the other side of the door. And I felt, and I said to my husband, that's not a head. And I felt two squishy bum cheeks. And I said, there's a bum. And I wasn't scared in that moment. I just kind of went, oh, there's a bum. And then the next thing I know, another contraction comes literally 30 seconds later, and the baby was out. The baby just fell out, right? I caught him, but he came out quite quickly. And the position he was in was bum first. He kind of came out like a fortune cookie, like he was squished in half, and he came out butt first and right out. But it was no concern. It wasn't laborious. It wasn't more painful. In fact, once the water broke and the baby came to the surface, it was all fairly quick. It was within a couple of minutes between the water breaking and the baby coming out, less than a few minutes. And so I felt, I just reached down and said to my husband, the baby's coming. And I reached down and said, oh, that's a bum. That's not a head. And then the next thing I know, he's out. And my poor husband was so disappointed because he had wanted to see that happen. And I didn't realize that he couldn't actually get in. He was trying to, but the yoga ball was in the way. So he couldn't see. He didn't see any of it. I did it alone completely with him on the other side of the door. And that's my one regret, is that he couldn't see. And he was kind of upset and disappointed that he didn't get to see his baby come into the world, because he did get to see our oldest son come in. But our bathroom was just too small and the yoga ball was quite big. And I didn't realize that he was never able to get it open more than a crack, and that I needed to have moved out of the way. But I was a little busy. I was a little busy pushing a baby out. And so the funny thing is that yes, the baby was breech, but I never knew that the baby was breech. I never had any ultrasounds. I never had any interventions. And so I had nothing to fear. And we had learned in the course, in the free birth course, that giving birth to a breech baby was rarely a problem, right? That it really was not anything remarkable, and that babies can come out really any way, and it doesn't really matter. And so when I did feel the bum, I felt no fear whatsoever. I just went, oh, that's a bum. And then the next thing I knew, the baby was out very swiftly, very quickly. I would argue that with my older son, when the head started to surface and emerge, it took a lot longer because I was forcing the pushing and it wasn't my body doing it. When your body's doing the pushing, it is powerful, it is strong, and boy, is it quick. And so the baby came out quickly, swiftly, and on his own. Out he came, and he gave a beautiful cry. So breathing right away, he did a little cough and a sputter, and then he cried, and he was beautiful. And I just sat on the bathroom floor and backed up. So my husband said, "Can you please back up so I can get in?" I didn't realize until that moment that he couldn't actually get into the bathroom. And so then he moved the yoga ball out of the way and actually came in and saw our son. Um, and I was able to nurse him right away, and he latched beautifully. And we just sat there on the bathroom floor for almost an hour. I just sat there nursing my son, holding my son, rubbing his back, letting him cry, holding him, looking at him. My husband went down and grabbed our 2-year-old and let him meet the baby. He seemed fairly uninterested. He kind of looked at him and went, okay, and kind of left and went and played with his toys in our bedroom. So he wasn't super interested at first. It was probably a lot to see. There was a lot of blood everywhere, so maybe he didn't enjoy seeing all of that, but he was happy to see that the baby was there. And after about an hour of just sitting there on the bathroom floor, I started to feel restless and kind of uncomfortable. And I said to my husband, I want to get off the floor. I want to get into bed. So he went and got a bowl, and I realized the placenta hadn't come out yet. And as soon as I stood up, um, it was like splat. The placenta just came out. Like it literally made a splat sound on the floor. It splat, it hit the ground, full placenta came out. And I said, "Oh, the placenta's out." And my husband said, "Well, great. I just got the bowl." And so he put the placenta in a bowl and he carried that in the bowl. And I walked over to our bed. My husband had covered the bed in a waterproof protective sheet and some towels. And I got into bed with the baby in my arms and the placenta in a bowl next to me. And we just hung out there for a couple of hours. My older son got into bed with us. He cuddled him a little bit. My older son tandem nursed with me. So he nursed on one side while the baby nursed on the other. We just had a little bonding experience and we just looked at our new baby and just enjoyed, the experience of the quiet and the calm. And then a couple of hours later, 2 or 3 hours later, I could see the baby was getting a little bit cold. I was ready to kind of go back to sleep. And I felt just ready to sort of be detached from the placenta. Felt that it would be a little difficult to lie down with the baby. I didn't want the cord to sort of pull on the baby's belly button. We were ready to release to cut the cord and clamp the cord. So I would say about 3 hours postpartum, 3 to 4 hours postpartum was when we decided to do that. And again, we had learned in our free birth course how to do this, how to clamp the cord. And then with our first son, Noah, the midwives had actually let us keep the scissors that we used to cut his umbilical cord. And we still had those special scissors. So we used the same pair. We had sanitized them ahead of time. And we used the same pair of scissors to cut our second son's umbilical cord that we used the first time around. And so we clamped the belly button. We cut the cord ourselves. My husband put on some gloves and inspected the placenta to make sure that it was whole and fully intact. And it was in fact beautiful and whole and looking great. So he took that away. He put it in a Ziploc bag, and it's still sitting in our freezer. Later on in the summer, we're going to plant it and plant a tree over it. But we just wanted to wait till it was a little bit warmer outside to do so. And yeah, and then I nursed the baby, and he and I were skin to skin, naked in bed, and we went and had a nap. And actually, my older son joined us, and the three of us just kind of went to sleep and had a little nap. And my husband went and took our dog for a walk because he hadn't been walked yet, and it was already about noon at that point. Baby was born at 8:08 a.m. And yeah, it was pretty sort of natural and common and unremarkable, I guess I want to say, the birthing experience. It didn't feel scary. It didn't feel medical. It just sort of felt like, yeah, like mom gave birth in the bathroom this morning, and now we're going to have nap because 12:30 is my 2-year-old son's nap time. And it was really just so nice to just be at home and to be in bed and to be surrounded by just my family and have nobody decide when things had to be done. And it was really beautiful. And so, again, like I said, this was the birth for me that felt empowering. This was the birth for me that felt, beautiful, that felt exactly, natural and spontaneous in the way that I had wanted it to be. And in some senses, it felt extremely unremarkable, right? Just a natural experience, right? Similar to kind of going to the bathroom and having a bowel movement. Like this is just sort of what my body did, and I allowed it to happen naturally and physiologically. And it was beautiful. And as I said, I don't think I could ever see myself giving birth any other way. I don't think I will ever um, invite the interventions of a medical practitioner into my birthing space ever again because I know that it's not necessary. And it was beautiful. And then I recovered at home. I stayed in bed for 2 to 3 days after that. My husband brought me food up to the bedroom, and our older son he would keep him occupied downstairs. And when he wanted to, my older son would come and play in the bedroom and come and be with us upstairs when needed. And it's been kind of like this ever since. just us at home, adjusting to life with 2. There have definitely been some adjustments. The co-sleeping with 2 babies has been a bit of an adjustment. The tandem nursing has been in the middle of the night has been a bit of an experience. Me figuring out a good position to nurse both babies while lying down has definitely been a bit of a learning curve. And we are finally catching up on sleep. We're finally figuring out how to sleep with both babies without, the little one waking up the bigger one. And, we're adjusting, we're getting there. Life is feeling good. I'm recovering, slowly but surely. And, I'm eager to sort of get back into life. But yeah, that is sort of my free birth story. So, yeah, I mean, I hope that it was maybe inspirational for some of you. And I think if I'm going to end off here with one thing, the one thing that I would love to share is that as radical as this may feel for some of you, I hope that maybe it can even just slightly open your eyes to the fact that maybe birth is a really natural, spontaneous process, that mammals do it all the time, that people have been, or women have been giving birth this way for thousands of years before sort of the medical um, structure had come into place and the medical infrastructure, I guess, and that birth doesn't have to be intervened with if you don't want it to be. And it just feels really good to kind of say, my body knew what to do and it always did. And as long as I allowed that process, nothing kind of goes wrong. You're good. And that was my comfort level. And again, like I said, I don't think I would do it any other way going forward as we have potentially children in the future. So, yeah, that's my incredible, beautiful free birth story. And in some ways, unremarkable free birth story where I gave birth at home and that was that. Um, so, yeah, that's my story. And I hope it was interesting for some of you, possibly enlightening and or empowering for others to consider other options if you're considering births for your future. And that's all I have to share for today. If you have questions or comments or anything you want to know about my experience, you can definitely reach out to me on Instagram at I am Jessica Rachel. I'm always happy to hear your feedback or answer your questions. If you're thinking about coming to this decision yourself, and yeah, that's all I have to share for today. So I will catch you in, don't forget to tune in tomorrow for the June energy forecast. And then I will catch you in the next episode. Have a beautiful one. Bye, guys.